Here's a schematic demonstrating the flow in the left portal vein branch going towards the liver and away from the shunt, indicating shunt dysfunction or stenosis. Here's an example of a patient who had flow going towards the shunt at one period and later developed flow going away from the shunt, indicated by the red color, away from the shunt and towards the liver, indicating that the flow through the shunt was no longer the path of least resistance. Here's an example of a patient who redeveloped a periumbilical venous collateral, indicating that the shunt is no longer serving as the principal pathway of blood flow through the liver. Within the shunt, 4 parameters have been elaborated. There can be a visible narrowing by color or power Doppler, particularly in the distal shunt. You can get absolute velocities within the shunt outside the 90 to 190 centimeters per second range. You can get a temporal change in velocities exceeding 50 centimeters per second. And by that I mean a change in the absolute velocity from one study to the next that exceeds 50 centimeters per second. Or you can see a focal velocity elevation within the shunt during the performance of a single examination. So as you're stepping through the shunt, you get a velocity elevation in excess of 100 centimeters per second. Here is an example of an absolute velocity in this shunt less than 90 centimeters per second, and you can see the visible narrowing on color Doppler. Here is an example of slow flow, relatively slow flow in the mid shunt of approximately 77 centimeters per second. That increases to 227 centimeters per second just beyond an area of stenosis. Here is another example of a visible narrowing of the color Doppler signal in the distal shunt caused by pseudointimal hyperplasia. Almost all stenoses do occur in the distal shunt, that is, at the hepatic venous end. In the post-shunt, one criteria is used. In the draining hepatic vein, a stenosis can occur, which will result in blood flow, instead of traveling to the inferior vena cava, for it to reverse in the right hepatic vein and go towards the liver. So reversal of flow in the draining hepatic vein, usually the right hepatic vein, indicates stenosis. Here is an example of a stenosis in the area of the draining hepatic vein here, and you can see that after intervention that flow has been reestablished. Using these 8 criteria, the sensitivity of Doppler for shunt stenosis is approximately 94%, with a positive predictive value in a screened population of 96%. Here is a table adopted from the reference by Kenterman et al. This came out in the AJR in 1997 and is widely used. But you can see that the sensitivities and specificities of the various criteria, and that the overall impression, you tend to be more sensitive than specific, which is the way it should be. By and large, you want to identify early shunt dysfunction with a high degree of sensitivity so that you can avoid the recurrence of either ascites or the reformation of collateral veins, because the reformation of some of these collaterals, especially esophageal collaterals, could result in catastrophic bleeding. One more recent index that has been proposed is so-called venous pulsatility index. And what is suggested here is that when you get a stenosis in the distal shunt, the hepatic venous end, that the cardiac pulsation will be dampened. And you can measure this VPI, venous pulsatility index, by taking the velocity maximal minus the velocity minimum over the velocity maximum, and a value of 0.16 or less is considered bad. This has been reported to be 94% sensitive and 87% specific. Basically, a flat line waveform is bad and indicates shunt dysfunction. This index has not been widely adopted, and these early positive and promising results are difficult to recreate in our laboratory. But this is the concept. Here's the cardiac pulsation seen in the tips in this patient, which over time is maintained, and this is good. This is a tip shunt where you see the cardiac pulsation, and later on the monophasic flow, or the flat line flow in the tips, which indicates shunt dysfunction. So this is bad. So if you see a monophasic flow in the setting of other indicial abnormalities or abnormalities of the other indices, you should suggest shunt dysfunction. There are alternative imaging techniques. These are not widely used. Ultrasound contrast agents it has more use in Europe and other countries than it is in the United States. Other people have advocated CT angiography and even MR angiography, but these are very expensive ways of evaluating a shunt that can be more effectively evaluated with ultrasound. And finally, I'm going to talk about some pitfalls that you might see in the performance of Doppler of tip shunts. First of all, remember that when a shunt is placed in the first few days after placement, you can get very abnormal hemodynamics and wildly abnormal indices. This will settle as the hemodynamics of the liver start to settle. So don't overinterpret abnormalities within the first days, and in particular, you often get intrashunt velocities that are quite high. Another caveat that you need to be aware of is a Doppler artifact that occurs at the edges of shunts. What this is analogous to the twinkle artifact, and this is what it looks like. You can get what looks to be flow at the periphery of the shunt, which is really just reflection from the very brightly echogenic shunt walls. This is, however, a completely occluded shunt. No flow is present within the shunt, though you get a power Doppler signal at the walls of the shunt itself. And here's the color Doppler example of that. And if you have any doubts about this being real or not real, I encourage you to use spectral Doppler to look at the waveform, and you'll see readily that it is simply noise. Here's another example of noise along the edges of the tip shunt. No flow is seen with color Doppler, and if you put the spectral Doppler on, it will confirm the absence of flow within the shunt itself. Another thing you should be aware of is that the velocities that you obtain within the shunt are dependent on the phase of respiration. If you look at the velocities within the tip shunt, you will see that it decreases with Valsalva. We did a study looking at the effects of patient position and respiratory state on the measurement of Doppler velocities in tips. We looked at 3 different positions, supine, upright, and decubitus, and 2 respiratory states, quiet respiration and deep inspiration. Here's an example of some measurements we did. This is measurements in the tip shunt. And you can see that in deep inspiration, the velocity declined from 104 centimeters per second to 80 centimeters per second. In a nutshell, suffice it to say that position was not an important factor in the measurement of these velocities, but respiration certainly was. The average velocity in quiet respiration was fully 22 centimeters per second greater than that in deep inspiration. And deep inspiration is analogous to the Valsalva maneuver. Here's another example of a tip shunt that was at 70 centimeters per second in quiet breathing that fell to 45 centimeters per second with the Valsalva maneuver. This is more of the results of that study, but suffice it to say that almost in a third of studies, the decline exceeded 50 centimeters per second and fell below the 90 to 190 range in almost half of cases. So this is an important factor when you do these measurements. It's important to do it the same way. If you take the initial set of measurements in quiet respiration, you should take all subsequent measurements in the same respiratory state. And by that, I mean that you should standardize your Doppler protocols so that you do it the same way each time, or that some notation is made in the report so that the person doing subsequent studies will do it in the same way. In conclusion, Doppler sonography can be a sensitive and relatively specific indicator for TIPS dysfunction. The keys to success is that you have to use multiple parameters, at least 8 that I described, compare with prior studies, and communicate with the clinical team. Thank you for your time and attention.